They decided in under 5 seconds. 5 seconds was all it took for them to look at her, scan her clothes, pause on her face, and silently agree on the same conclusion. She doesn't belong here. Imani Carter felt it before anyone spoke. That subtle shift in the air. The way eyes lingered half a second too long. The way silence tightened instead of relaxed. First class was quiet the way money is quiet. Leather seats, soft lighting, low voices trained not to sound impressed by comfort. Imani slid into seat 2A without ceremony. No announcement, no hesitation, just calm, controlled, precise. And that's when the problem began. Karen Whitfield stopped walking. Her heels froze mid-step. Her smile flickered. Just slightly, but enough. Karen's eyes dropped to Imani's boarding pass, then rose back to her face, slower this time. "This section is first class," Karen said. Not loud, not rude, but firm enough to draw blood. Imani didn't look up immediately. She placed her bag in the overhead bin first, slowly, deliberately. "Yes," she said calmly. "I know." Karen didn't move. Around them, other passengers pretended not to watch while watching everything. A man folded his newspaper but didn't turn the page. A woman adjusted her scarf twice. Karen smiled again, this one tighter. "May I see your boarding pass?" Imani handed it over without flinching. "Seat 2A, first class, clear as daylight." Karen stared at it, too long. Then she laughed, a small, uncomfortable sound. "Oh, I think there's been a mistake." That word. Mistake. Imani finally looked up. "No," she said. "There hasn't." The temperature dropped. Karen glanced down the aisle toward Melissa Grant, the senior flight attendant. A look passed between them, a look that didn't need words. Melissa approached, already nodding. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already decided. Karen lowered her voice. "She's seated in 2A. Melissa looked at Imani the way someone looks at luggage they don't remember packing. "Ma'am," Melissa said, "we'll need you to move back to economy while we sort this out." That was it. No apology, no verification, no system check, just removal. Imani sat back. "No," she said again, same calm, sharper edge. Melissa blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm not moving," Imani said. "This is my seat." Karen crossed her arms. Melissa's voice hardened. "If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate." There it was. Escalate. A word designed to sound procedural while threatening everything. Passengers were listening now. A collective stillness fell over the cabin. Imani could feel the weight of it, the expectation, the script they'd already written for her. Be loud, be angry, prove them right. Instead, she smiled. "Please do," she said. Melissa stiffened. She turned sharply and headed for the cockpit. That's when the whispers started. "She must be in the wrong seat. First-class tickets aren't cheap. They'll sort it out." Ethan Miller, seated across the aisle, leaned forward slightly. "They already sorted it out," he muttered. "Just not fairly." Imani heard him. She didn't respond. Because she knew something they didn't. Because while they were busy deciding who she looked like, they hadn't bothered to ask who she was. The cockpit door opened. Captain Robert Hale stepped out with the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. "What's the situation?" he asked. Melissa spoke quickly. "Passenger refusing to move from first class. Boarding pass may be incorrect." Robert looked at Imani. That same pause, that same scan. Imani met his gaze without blinking. "Ma'am," Robert said, "we need to resolve this before departure." "Agreed," Imani said. "I suggest you check the manifest." Karen scoffed under her breath. Robert turned to Karen. "Did you verify?" Karen hesitated. "Well," that hesitation landed like a crack in glass. Robert nodded slowly. "Let me see the pass." He examined it, then frowned, then checked his tablet. His jaw tightened. Melissa shifted uneasily. "Captain?" Robert looked up. "Seat 2A is correct." Silence slammed into the cabin. Karen's face flushed. "Then why?" Robert raised a hand. "Why what?" Karen swallowed. Melissa tried to recover. "There must be—" "Enough," Robert said. Imani stood. The movement alone commanded attention. "I'd like to ask something," she said evenly. Robert nodded. "Of course." "Would this conversation be happening?" Imani asked. "If I look different?" No one breathed. That question hung there, sharp, undeniable. Robert opened his mouth, closed it, because there was no answer that wouldn't indict someone. Imani continued. "You didn't ask my name," she said. "You didn't apologize. You didn't verify before accusing." Karen stared at the floor. Melissa's face drained of color. Robert cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience." Imani smiled again. "Inconvenience," she repeated softly. "That's an interesting word for public humiliation." She reached into her bag. The cabin tensed. She pulled out a phone, unlocked it, and pressed play. A recorded call filled the air. "This is Thomas Reynolds from corporate—" Melissa's eyes widened. Karen's breath caught. Imani held the phone up. "That," she said, "is your chief operations officer." The recording continued. "Imani Carter is flying today under full corporate clearance. Any interference will be treated as a direct violation of company protocol." The sound stopped. Imani looked directly at Melissa. "At the time you asked me to move," she said, "I was already documenting." Melissa staggered back. Karen whispered, "Oh my God." Imani turned to the passengers. "I didn't want to do this on the plane," she said calmly, "but you made a spectacle of me. So now we'll be accurate." She faced Robert. "I am Imani Carter," she said, "Senior Compliance Director, third-party auditor, and effective this morning I am here to evaluate operational bias." Robert's face went pale. Imani continued. "Before this flight lands," she said, "reports will be filed, access logs will be reviewed, and personnel decisions will be made." Karen shook her head. "You can't—" Imani cut her off with a glance. "I already have." She sat back down. Fasten seatbelt sign dinged. The plane pushed back from the gate. Careers didn't end with yelling. They ended quietly, at cruising altitude, and everyone on that plane knew. They thought she didn't belong. They were wrong. Nothing happened right away. That was the most unsettling part. The plane climbed smoothly, engines humming like nothing had been disturbed. The cabin lights dimmed to their programmed glow. Drinks were poured. Seatbelts clicked open. To anyone not paying attention, it looked like the moment had passed. But moments like that don't pass. They wait. Imani Carter sat still in seat 2A, hands folded loosely in her lap. Her breathing was steady, her expression unreadable, the kind of calm that isn't peace, but preparation. Around her, first class had changed, not visibly, but unmistakably. Melissa Grant no longer made eye contact with anyone. She moved slower now, more carefully, as if every step were being recorded, even when it wasn't. Karen Whitfield avoided the aisle entirely. She stayed near the galley. whispering too quickly into the intercom, stopping mid-sentence whenever someone passed by. Captain Robert Hale hadn't come back out. That told Imani everything she needed to know. The promise had already been made. Ethan Miller leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "I've never seen that happen before," he said. Imani didn't look at him. "Most people don't," she replied, "because it usually ends quietly." He nodded, unsure what else to say. Across the aisle, a woman pretended to sleep, her eyes flickering beneath closed lids. A man 2 rows back kept glancing at the cockpit door, as if expecting it to open and swallow someone whole. No one spoke above a whisper. The cabin crew moved like guests in someone else's house. That was new. Melissa approached Imani again, but this time, her tone had changed. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "can I get you anything?" Imani looked up slowly. "Yes," she said. "I'd like some water." Melissa nodded too fast. "Of course." She returned moments later, hands shaking just enough to notice. "Here you are." Imani accepted the glass. "Thank you," she said. Melissa lingered, uncertain. "Miss Carter," she began, then stopped. "Yes? If there was any misunderstanding earlier," Imani raised one finger. "Stop," she said calmly. Melissa froze. "This isn't the part where we clean it up with words," Imani continued. "This is the part where we let it be accurate." Melissa swallowed. "Understood." She stepped away. Accuracy was dangerous. That's why people avoided it. Imani took a sip of water and stared straight ahead. She thought about how many times she'd watched this exact sequence unfold in reports and transcripts. The initial assumption, the misplaced authority, the scramble to soften language once power changed hands. It was always the same. Only the setting changed. She reached for her phone, not to record this time, but to review. Timestamps, voice IDs, response delays, every detail already logged. Somewhere above the clouds, Thomas Reynolds was reading an email he hadn't expected to receive mid-flight. Somewhere on the ground, a compliance team was pulling personnel files. And somewhere between altitude and inevitability, consequences were aligning themselves. The cockpit door finally opened. Captain Hale stepped out, slower than before. No authority in his stride now, only intention. He stopped beside Imani's seat. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. "May I speak with you?" She looked up. "Here is fine." He nodded. "I want to formally apologize," he said, "for how this was handled." Imani tilted her head. "Handled implies completion." Robert exhaled. "Fair point." He hesitated, then continued. "I've reviewed the manifest, the clearance, the call. I understand now." Imani's gaze stayed steady. "Understanding isn't corrective action," she said. "No," Robert agreed, "but it's a start." She waited. "The airline takes these matters seriously," he added. Imani almost smiled. Almost. "That sentence," she said, "appears in every report I've ever written." Robert looked down. "What happens next?" There it was. Not if. When. Imani leaned back slightly. "What happens next," she said, "depends on what already happened before today." He frowned. "You see," she continued, "incidents don't exist in isolation. They stack, they repeat, they pattern." Robert nodded slowly. "And when a pattern becomes visible," she said, "it stops being a misunderstanding." Silence stretched. Robert straightened. "I'll cooperate fully." "I know," Imani said. "You already are." He left without another word. The plane settled into cruise. Meals were served. Silverware clinked too loudly in the quiet cabin. Karen Whitfield finally approached. Her eyes were red. "Miss Carter," she whispered. "May I speak to you privately?" Imani looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said gently. "Nothing about this was private." Karen's shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean—" "I know," Imani said. "You meant to follow instinct." Karen flinched. "And that," Imani continued, "is exactly the issue." Karen nodded, tears forming. "I've worked here 12 years. Imani didn't respond. "I've never had a complaint." Imani met her eyes. "Today isn't about your record," she said. "It's about your reflex." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. "That reflex," Imani added, "didn't come from nowhere." Karen stepped back. The truth was heavier than blame. Across the cabin, passengers pretended not to listen, but they were listening. Everyone was, because they'd all felt it before. That subtle moment when someone else decided where you belonged. Imani glanced out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath them. So much space, so many systems built to feel invisible. She spoke again, quietly, but clearly. "Let me be very clear," she said, not addressing anyone in particular. "This is not punishment. This is correction." No one moved. "People think consequences are loud," she continued. "They think they come with shouting and spectacle." She shook her head slightly. "They don't. They come with paperwork and silence and meetings you don't get invited to." The cabin remained still. "This flight," she said, "will land normally." A pause. "But it will not arrive unchanged." That was the promise line. No threat, no drama, just certainty. Later, as the lights dimmed further and passengers settled into uneasy rest, Ethan spoke again. "You didn't raise your voice once," he said. Imani smiled faintly. "I didn't need to." He nodded. "They knew." "Yes," she said, "and so did everyone watching." She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to wait. Because tension doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits there, growing. The descent began without ceremony. A soft chime, a gentle announcement. The kind of voice that pretends nothing has changed. But everything had. Imani Carter felt it before the plane tilted downward. That subtle tightening in the cabin. That collective awareness that whatever had been suspended in the air was about to land with them. She straightened her jacket, not because she needed to, but because moments like this deserved posture. The cockpit door opened again. This time, it didn't creak. Captain Robert Hale stepped out with purpose, followed closely by First Officer Daniel Brooks. Neither of them looked at the passengers. Both of them looked directly at Imani. That alone was enough. Melissa Grant noticed and stopped mid-step. Karen Whitfield froze by the galley. Imani stood. The sound of it, the faint scrape of shoes against carpet, cut through the cabin like a blade. Robert cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he said, voice steady but strained. "We've received communication from corporate." Imani nodded. "I know." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. They want to speak with you." Imani didn't ask how. She already knew where this was going. Robert gestured toward the forward galley. "If you'd prefer privacy?" "No," Imani said, calmly but unmistakably. "This continues where it started." That word again, continues, not resolves, not concludes. Passengers lifted their heads, phones stayed down, but attention was absolute. Robert hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Imani spoke before anyone else could. "Before you say anything," she said, "I want the record to be clear." She turned slowly, letting her gaze sweep across first class. across every face that had watched, every mouth that had stayed closed, every eye that had calculated comfort over conscience. "This was not a misunderstanding," she said. The snap was immediate. The cabin stiffened. "This was not a mix-up," she continued. "This was not a procedural error." She paused. "This was racial bias." No one inhaled. The word landed hard. No cushioning, no apology. Racial bias. Karen Whitfield's knees buckled slightly. She grabbed the counter. Melissa Grant's face went completely still. Robert opened his mouth. Imani raised her hand. "I'm not finished." She turned to Karen first. "You didn't question my seat because of a system alert," she said. "You questioned it because you looked at me and decided I didn't match your mental image of first class." Karen shook her head weakly. "I didn't." "You did," Imani cut in, "whether consciously or not." Then she turned to Melissa. "You escalated without verification," she said. "You used authority as a shortcut." Melissa swallowed hard. "I followed protocol." Imani's eyes sharpened. "No," she said. "You skipped it." That was the snap. Protocol was supposed to protect people. Skipping it revealed why. Imani faced Robert. "And you," she said, "allowed the situation to progress without intervention because the discomfort wasn't yours." Robert's jaw tightened. "I corrected it as soon as you confirmed my power," Imani finished. Silence roared. Daniel Brooks shifted his weight, finally speaking. "This is getting intense," he said carefully. Passengers are fine," Imani said. "They're witnessing accountability." She reached into her bag again. This time, she pulled out a printed document. She unfolded it slowly. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. No one answered. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a pattern analysis." She turned one page. 12 prior complaints, she continued. 8 involving seat challenges. 6 involving black passengers. 0 resulting in corrective action. Melissa whispered, "That can't be right." Imani looked at her. "It is." Karen slid down onto a jump seat, eyes glassy. Imani kept going. "You see, bias doesn't need intention," she said. "It needs repetition." She turned another page. "Same routes. Same cabin. Same staff clusters." She lowered the papers. "This flight," she said, "wasn't the first time." That's when it broke. A woman in row 3 spoke up. "I saw it once before," she said quietly. "A man. Same thing. Different outcome." Heads turned. Another passenger nodded. "I remember that." Ethan Miller leaned forward. "They moved him. No apology." The cabin shifted, from audience to evidence. Imani didn't smile. "This," she said, "is how systems protect themselves, by isolating incidents, by exhausting individuals." She stepped closer to Karen. "But systems fail," she continued, "when patterns are named." Karen sobbed softly. "I didn't think—" "That's the problem," Imani said. "You didn't have to." Robert took a step forward. "What are you asking for?" he said. Imani looked at him. "Not permission," she replied. She turned slightly, answering the question anyway. "I'm asking for accuracy," she said. "In the reports. In the language. In the consequences." She raised her voice, not loud, but unmistakably firm. "This will not be logged as a customer service issue." The snap echoed. "This will not be softened into miscommunication." Another pause. "This will be recorded as racial discrimination." Melissa gasped. Karen covered her mouth. Robert closed his eyes briefly. Daniel looked stunned. "That's serious." "Yes," Imani said. "It is." she continued, unrelenting now. Because when you don't name it, you repeat it. And when you repeat it, you normalize it. And when you normalize it, you become responsible for it. The intercom crackled. A voice came through, tight, rushed. Captain Hale, this is Thomas Reynolds. The name hit like a gavel. Robert reached for the receiver. Imani shook her head. Put it on speaker. Robert hesitated, then obeyed. Thomas, Imani said evenly. You're on. Silence on the line. Then, Miss Carter, I assume you've reviewed the materials, she said. Yes, Thomas replied, and I want to be clear. This does not reflect our values. Imani didn't flinch. Values aren't what you say, she replied. They're what survives contact. A pause. What do you recommend? Thomas asked. Imani looked around the cabin one last time, at the crew, at the passengers, at the system exposed mid-flight. Immediate removal of involved staff pending investigation, she said. Mandatory bias audits. And public acknowledgement. Karen let out a broken sound. Melissa stared at the floor. Thomas exhaled audibly. Approved, he said. The word echoed. Approved. Imani nodded once. Good, she said. We're aligned. The line went dead. No applause, no cheers. Just the heavy realization that something irreversible had happened. Robert spoke quietly. We'll be landing in 20 minutes. Imani sat back down. She had done what she came to do. As the plane descended, the cabin felt smaller, heavier. Truth has that effect. Karen and Melissa remained frozen. No longer crew, not yet former. Passengers stared straight ahead, processing their own silence. Ethan whispered, obey. They won't forget this. Imani looked out the window. They shouldn't, she said. The wheels touched the runway with a jolt. Metal met ground, and with it reality arrived. They had thought she didn't belong. What they learned, too late, was that injustice always knows exactly where it belongs, and this time, it had been named. The engines powered down. That was the loudest sound anyone heard. After hours of tension disguised as routine, the sudden quiet felt wrong, like a room holding its breath long after the argument has ended. No one moved. Seatbelt signs went dark, but bodies stayed still. Passengers stared straight ahead, suddenly aware of their hands, their knees, the weight of what they'd witnessed. Imani Carter remained seated. She didn't reach for her bag, didn't stand, didn't rush the moment away. Because silence had work to do. The flight attendants didn't make the usual announcement. No cheerful thanks for flying. No practiced smiles. Karen Whitfield sat frozen on the jump seat, eyes fixed on a spot that wasn't there. Melissa Grant stood near the galley, posture rigid, hands folded too tightly. Neither of them spoke. Pressure doesn't need words. It just waits. The aircraft door opened with a muted hiss. Still no one clapped. No one checked their phone. Time stretched. Imani finally stood. That was the invisible snap. Not dramatic, not loud, but final. The movement broke the spell. People shifted in their seats. Someone exhaled sharply, as if realizing they'd been holding their breath for 20 minutes. Imani lifted her bag from the overhead bin with care. She didn't look at anyone yet. Behind her, footsteps echoed. Not rushed, not confident, measured. A man in a dark jacket stepped onto the plane. No uniform, no badge, just a tablet held close to his chest and eyes that took in everything without reacting. He nodded once, to no one in particular. Melissa noticed him first, her face drained of color. Karen followed her gaze. That was when fear finally arrived. Not panic. Not tears. fear with paperwork behind it. The man spoke quietly. Karen Whitfield? Melissa Grant? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Please remain seated. The words were polite. They landed like restraints. Passengers pretended not to watch. They always did. The man turned to Imani. "Miss Carter," he said, "ground team is ready." Imani nodded. "I'll be right there." She paused, then turned, not to the crew but to the cabin, to the witnesses. "This part," she said calmly, "is usually where people think it's over." No one spoke. "But accountability," she continued, "doesn't end when the doors open. That's just when it becomes inconvenient." She didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She simply stated. Then she walked forward. The aisle felt longer than before. People watched her pass, some with guilt, some with relief, some with something close to gratitude. Ethan Miller met her eyes briefly. He nodded. Imani nodded back. Outside the plane, the jet bridge felt colder, brighter. The airport hummed with normalcy. Rolling suitcases, distant announcements, people arguing about coffee, life going on. That's how systems survive. They count on normal. Imani stopped just outside the aircraft door. Behind her, voices rose for the first time. Karen was crying now. "I didn't mean it," she kept saying. "I swear I didn't mean it." The man with the tablet didn't respond. Meaning was irrelevant. Melissa spoke next. Her voice was controlled, but strained. "I followed procedure." The man finally looked at her. "No," he said. "You followed instinct." The distinction hung there. Imani didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Pressure had shifted. Inside the plane, passengers began to stand, slowly filing out. They passed the frozen crew, avoiding eye contact, carrying their bags like shields. Some looked embarrassed, others looked thoughtful. A few looked angry, but not at Imani. At themselves. In the terminal, a small group waited near the gate. Not security, not executives, observers, clipboards, tablets, neutral faces. Imani joined them. One of them spoke quietly. "We've secured statements from the cockpit and cabin." Imani nodded. "Good." Another asked, "Would you like to review them now?" "Not yet," she said. "Let them sit." "Why?" "Because pressure works best when it's uninterrupted." The observers exchanged glances. They understood. Back on the plane, the air felt heavier with every minute that passed. Karen and Melissa remained seated. No instructions, no reassurance, just waiting. That's when the pivot began. Not outward, inward. Karen stopped crying. The silence forced thought to surface, the kind she'd always pushed away. Moments replayed in her mind. Other passengers, other assumptions. Other times, she'd felt that same certainty without evidence. She saw it now, and she couldn't unsee it. Melissa's thoughts went somewhere else, to policy manuals, to training sessions, to the words implicit bias that had always sounded abstract. Until now. Abstract ideas don't cost you your job. Concrete moments do. Minutes passed, then more. No one told them what was happening. That was intentional. Pressure reveals priorities. Finally, the man returned. "Karen Whitfield," he said. "Please, come with me." Karen stood on unsteady legs. She looked at Melissa. Melissa didn't reach out. Karen hesitated, then followed. The door closed behind them. Melissa was alone now. That's when it hit her. Not fear, isolation. She had always believed authority insulated her, protected her. Now she understood. Authority without accountability was exposure. Outside, Imani watched through the glass as Karen was escorted down the jet bridge. No handcuffs, No spectacle, just removal. The most effective kind. An observer leaned toward Imani. Public relations is asking how to frame this. Imani didn't look away. Tell them the truth, she said. They won't like that. They don't have to, she replied. They just have to stop lying. The observer nodded slowly. That will cause backlash. Imani finally turned. Good, she said. That means it's working. Back inside, Melissa was finally asked to stand. Her voice was steady when she spoke. Am I being terminated? The man with the tablet paused. No, he said. Not yet. Relief flickered across her face. Then he continued. You're being documented. The relief vanished. Documentation, he added, is permanent. That was the real snap. Invisible. Irreversible. Imani took a breath. This was the pivot point. Not for the airline, for the story. Because up until now, this had been about what happened to her. What was said. What was assumed. What was exposed. But now, it was about what happened to everyone else. Passengers began posting, not videos, but words. I was on that flight. I saw it. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Silence broke online in fragments. Not outrage. Recognition. That was more dangerous. In a conference room somewhere, executives stared at screens, realizing the narrative wasn't theirs anymore. No villain to scapegoat, no hero to package, just a system forced into clarity. Imani checked her phone. Messages poured in, some supportive, some defensive, some furious. She didn't respond. Not yet. She had learned something years ago. The loudest moment is rarely the most important. The pivot happens after, when people go home, when they replay it, when they ask themselves where they stood. She looked back toward the plane one last time. The door was closed now, empty. Nothing about it looked dramatic. And yet, everything had changed. Because injustice doesn't always collapse under confrontation. Sometimes it shifts under pressure. Sometimes it reveals itself in silence. And sometimes... The most powerful snap is the one no one hears. That was the pivot. And this story wasn't over. It was just no longer about her alone. The story broke quietly. Not with headlines screaming injustice, not with looping videos or trending hashtags. Just a sentence. An airline is under internal review following allegations of discriminatory conduct aboard a domestic flight. No names yet, no outrage yet. But the sentence spread, and with it came recognition. Imani Carter read it on her phone while sitting alone in a hotel room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The curtains were half drawn. The city outside buzzed with the indifference of people who hadn't been on that flight. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone resting in her palm, and waited. Because revelation doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks. The second article named the airline. The third mentioned a senior compliance official. By the fourth, speculation had turned into certainty. And that's when the cost began to show itself. Her phone buzzed again, a message from a colleague she trusted. Be careful. This is getting attention you can't control. Imani stared at the screen. Control was always the illusion. She typed back, I never had it. Across town, a conference room filled slowly with executives who had spent their careers mastering tone instead of truth. PowerPoint slides, risk assessments, language reviews. No one mentioned her name out loud, yet every sentence bent around it. This could damage the brand. This could create precedent. This could escalate. That word again. Escalate. As if injustice hadn't already done that on its own. Imani didn't attend that meeting. She didn't need to. She'd already submitted her findings. They were clinical, unemotional, unavoidable. Bias was named. Patterns were documented. Failures were traced, not to individuals alone, but to systems that rewarded silence and punished disruption. That's why the backlash didn't come from where people expected. It didn't come from the public. It came from inside. A call from human resources. Imani, the voice said carefully, we need to discuss your role in how this unfolded. Imani leaned back in her chair. Which part? She asked. The documentation or the truth? A pause. Your presence on the flight, the voice continued, has raised questions. Questions about what? About optics. There it was. Optics. The cousin of denial. You're suggesting, Imani said evenly, that being there was the problem. No, the voice replied quickly. Not the problem. Just complicated. Imani smiled without humor. Truth is always complicated, she said. Lies are efficient. The call ended with no resolution. That was intentional too. Pressure doesn't always push. Sometimes it waits for you to fold yourself. Days passed. The airline issued a statement, carefully worded, painfully vague. We are committed to diversity and inclusion, the usual promises. But then came the addendum. Several staff members have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. That landed harder. Names weren't released. But everyone knew. Karen Whitfield didn't leave her apartment for 2 days. Melissa Grant returned to work, but not to the cabin. She was reassigned, observed, documented. Every interaction now carried weight. That was consequence, not destruction. Exposure. Imani watched it all from a distance, and the distance cost her too. A speaking engagement was quietly canceled. A consulting request disappeared. A colleague stopped replying to messages. No explanation, just absence. That was the price no one warned you about. Not punishment, isolation. The system doesn't always strike back. Sometimes it steps aside and lets gravity do the rest. One evening, as the sun dipped behind glass towers, Imani sat across from her sister at a small restaurant. The food cooled between them. You okay? Her sister asked. Imani hesitated. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Her sister nodded. That means yes. Eventually. Imani looked down at her hands. They're saying I went too far. Her sister snorted softly. They always do. They're saying I made it about race. Her sister leaned forward. Was it? Imani didn't answer immediately. Yes, she said finally. And pretending it wasn't would have been easier. Her sister smiled sadly. Easy has never been your thing. The next revelation came from an unexpected place. A junior employee, anonymous at first, released internal emails. Not dramatic, not explosive, just ordinary conversations, jokes, assumptions, language that revealed how normalized exclusion had become. The public didn't rage. They recognized. And recognition is harder to deflect. That's when the airline shifted tone. The CEO appeared on camera. No script this time. We failed, he said. 2 words, simple, costly. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was specific. And specificity is the enemy of denial. Imani watched the clip alone. She didn't celebrate. Apologies weren't victories. They were admissions. And admissions always came with aftershocks. The aftershocks came for her next. An internal review of her conduct concluded she had acted within mandate, but had exposed the company to reputational risk. She read the phrase twice. Risk. She closed the document and set it aside. That was the controlled snap. Not anger, acceptance. She understood now. Truth-tellers are tolerated only until they're inconvenient. After that, they're categorized. Difficult, unpredictable, risky. Those labels follow you. Weeks later, a letter arrived. Not from the airline. From a woman she didn't know. "I was on that flight," the letter read. "I didn't say anything. I wish I had. But I've been thinking about it every day since." Imani folded the letter carefully. Then another came, and another. Different people. Same message. Witnesses processing their silence. That was the real consequence. Not firings, not headlines. Awareness that couldn't be undone. Imani realized something then. The cost wasn't just hers. It had transferred. That was the pivot she hadn't planned. She received one final call from the same HR voice. "We want to move forward," the voice said. "Without me?" Imani asked. A pause. "With you," the voice corrected, "but differently." Imani considered it. Different often meant quieter, smaller, contained. "No," she said finally. "I'm not interested in being used as proof of progress." Another pause. "What are you interested in?" Imani looked out the window. "I'm interested in making sure this doesn't happen again," she said. "Even when no one like me is on the plane." The line went silent. That answer didn't fit a policy. She declined the revised contract the next day, walked away without a backup plan. That was the highest cost. Security. But something else replaced it. Clarity. Months later, the airline implemented mandatory bias audits across all routes. Other companies followed, quietly. No credit given, no spotlight returned. Imani didn't chase it. She had learned the final lesson. Change rarely thanks the people who force it. It just moves forward and pretends it was always heading that way. One evening back home, she replayed the moment in her mind. The pause, the assumption, the word escalate. She understood now. They hadn't thought she didn't belong. They'd thought the system would protect them if they acted on that belief. They were wrong, and she paid for proving it. But some costs aren't losses. They're investments. In truth, in clarity, in the refusal to disappear quietly. The story ended the way these stories always do, not with closure, with responsibility. Because the real consequence of naming injustice is that you can never stop seeing it. And once you see it, you belong to the people who don't look away. Most people remember exactly where they were when something important happened. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because, in hindsight, they realized they were part of it. Even if they said nothing, that flight became one of those moments. Not for headlines, not for the airline, for the people who watched. Weeks later, when the story had settled into archives and internal memos, the passengers began to remember details they hadn't noticed at the time. The way the cabin went quiet. The way authority hesitated when it was questioned. The way no one rushed to intervene, because no one wanted to be wrong. They remembered where they were standing. That's how moral landings work. They don't arrive with impact. They arrive with reflection. Imani Carter understood this better than anyone. She didn't expect thanks. Didn't expect vindication. Didn't expect the system to applaud its own exposure. What she expected, what she counted on, was discomfort. Because discomfort is the first honest response. She sat in a lecture hall months later, not as a speaker, but as a listener. A panel discussion about bias, leadership, and accountability unfolded on stage. The language was careful. Too careful. Words like unconscious, unintentional, complex floated through the air like insulation. No one said choice. Imani watched the audience instead of the panel. She could see it on their faces. They weren't asking, "What happened?" They were asking, "What would I have done?" That's the mirror. It doesn't accuse, it asks. A man in the third row shifted in his seat. He'd been on the flight. He remembered thinking, someone else will say something. A woman near the aisle remembered how relieved she felt when the captain intervened, because it meant she didn't have to. Relief, one of the most dangerous emotions in moments of injustice, because relief feels like resolution, but it isn't. It's abdication. Imani didn't blame them. That's the part people misunderstand. Accountability isn't about blame. It's about ownership. The panel ended. Applause followed. Polite, contained, people stood, gathered their things, returned to lives where decisions were easier. Imani remained seated. She always waited for the room to empty. That's when truth showed up, quietly, unguarded. A young woman approached her. "I wanted to say, thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Imani asked. "For not letting it slide." Imani studied her face. "Would you have?" she asked. The woman hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "Before, probably." Imani nodded. "That's why it mattered," she said. "Not because it was heroic, because it interrupted habit. That's the part no one tells you. Injustice survives on habit, on patterns repeated until they feel natural, until questioning them feels disruptive." Imani walked home that evening through streets buzzing with ordinary life. People argued over parking, laughed into phones, complained about small things. Normalcy again. She'd learned something important. The world doesn't change all at once. It pivots, quietly, in individuals, one decision at a time. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan Miller. "I think about that flight more than I expected," she replied. "Good." A pause. "That sounds strange," he wrote. "It's not," she answered. "It means you're still awake." He sent another message. "I keep wondering why I didn't speak up sooner." Imani stopped walking. This was the call. Not scripted, not public, real. She typed carefully. "Because the cost wasn't clear yet." "It is now," he replied. Yes, that was the point. Consequences make cost visible. That's why systems resist them. Weeks later, Ethan found himself in a meeting at work. A colleague dismissed a concern raised by a junior employee, quickly, casually. No malice, no intent. Just reflex. Ethan felt it immediately, that tightening, that pause from the flight. This time, he didn't wait. "I think we should slow down," he said. "Let's hear her out." The room shifted. Someone rolled their eyes. But the junior employee spoke. That moment wouldn't make the news. It wouldn't trend. But it mattered more than 1,000 statements. That's the choice. It never announces itself. It shows up disguised as inconvenience. Imani received fewer messages as time passed. That was expected. Outrage fades. Reflection lingers. She didn't chase relevance. She let the story do what stories are supposed to do. Change who's listening. One afternoon, she was invited, not to speak, but to consult on a policy rewrite. She read the draft carefully, not looking for buzzwords, looking for gaps. "Where's the accountability clause?" she asked. The room went quiet. "That's implied," someone said. Imani shook her head. "Then it won't survive pressure," she replied. They rewrote it. That was the work. Unseen, uncelebrated, necessary. Months later, a training video was released internally. Not dramatic, just clear. It didn't say, "Don't be racist." It said, pause before acting on certainty. That was smarter. Because certainty is where bias hides. Imani watched the video once, then turned it off. She didn't need to see more. The mirror had already been placed. The call had already been made. Now came the final piece, the choice. And this was the part no narrator could make for anyone else. Because the choice doesn't belong to Imani. It belongs to whoever is watching. Right now. You. Because you've been there. Maybe not on a plane, but in a room where someone was questioned for no good reason. In a line where someone was treated like an exception. In a moment where silence felt safer than interruption. You remember where you were standing. You remember the relief when someone else handled it. That relief is the tell. That's where the mirror lives. This story doesn't ask if you're good or bad. It asks something harder. What do you do when the cost becomes visible? Do you look away because it's uncomfortable? Do you explain it because that feels productive? Or do you interrupt it, knowing that interruption always costs something? That's the choice they faced on that flight. That's the choice Ethan faced later. That's the choice you will face again. Because injustice doesn't need villains. It needs witnesses who stay quiet. Imani understood this. That's why she never framed herself as the hero. Heroes let others off the hook. Responsibility doesn't. The flight landed months ago. The story ended on paper, but the moral didn't land there. It landed wherever someone pauses instead of assuming, where someone speaks instead of deferring, where someone chooses discomfort over relief. That's the landing. Not smooth, not announced, but final. And now the mirror is yours. The call has been made. The only thing left is the choice. It didn't end with a headline. It didn't end with a firing. It didn't even end with that second video. Stories like this never end where people expect them to. They end somewhere quieter, later, when no one is watching. Because the truth is, the most important moment on that flight didn't belong to Imani Carter. It belonged to everyone who watched, and to everyone watching now. Months after the plane landed, nothing about the world looked different at first glance. Flights still boarded, meetings still happened, lines still formed, authority still spoke first. But something subtle had shifted. People paused more. Questions surfaced where certainty used to live. Someone interrupted instead of assuming. Someone asked instead of obeying. Someone spoke instead of waiting for permission. Not everywhere, not always, but enough. And that's how change actually works. Not through grand gestures, through uncomfortable seconds, through moments when silence is easier, but you don't choose it. Imani Carter never became famous. That part surprises people. No book deal, no viral victory tour. She went back to work, different work, quieter work, the kind that doesn't trend. But every now and then, she'd get a message. I remembered your story. I said something. They backed off. Those messages mattered more than applause ever could. Because they meant the burden had shifted. The story was no longer hers to carry alone. That was the real ending. Not justice delivered perfectly, but responsibility redistributed. And now, here's the part no narrator can soften. You didn't just hear a story, you were placed inside it. Because whether it happens on a plane, in a meeting, at a counter, or in a comment section, you will see this moment again. You'll feel that pause, that calculation, that quiet voice that says, someone else will handle it. That's the moment this story was written for. And when it comes, the question won't be, what happened on that flight? It will be, What did you do when you were there? If this story made you uncomfortable, good. If it made you think, even better. And if it made you realize you've been a witness before, then stay, subscribe. Because these stories aren't about entertainment. They're about recognition. They're about the moments that test who we are when no one is keeping score. And the next one? It might look uncomfortably familiar. Hit subscribe. Not for me. For the version of you who won't look away next time.